Welcome to Town Hall. Let's start in the usual way with Pledge of Allegiance and the attendance from the town clerk. All right, let's do the Pledge of Allegiance. Please stand.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay.
Sorry, missed that.
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
On a roll call. Councilman Croy. Present. Councilman Divney.
Here.
Councilman Valentine.
Here.
Councilman Batari.
Here.
Supervisor Stewart.
Here. Thanks, Charlie. Couple quick announcements. There's a public hearing on December 19th, regulation of devices in public rights of way and easements. There's a project going on with the rail trail and O&R and vegetation removal and a new fence, which Vicky and Eric and others have struggled mightily to try to move that project from O&R's kind of draconian approach to vegetation removal through a successful outcome with the town residents along the rail trail having replacement screening. So thanks to folks who, Vicky and Eric in particular, but also I know John Edwards directly involved, and the town residents themselves for working that out a bit. We do have a presentation tonight from the Musial group. I see Mr. Musial in the back row there. Thank you for coming out on this rainy night. Appreciate that. And we also are scheduled to start a public hearing on some, which we will open but continue into January to get a conversation started around some draft code amendments related to performance standards, which we've been working on. So we'll talk about that. For my money, I would like to start with our architects making a presentation. If the town board is all right with that, it'll push our hearing back probably by about 15 or 20 minutes. But then we can get into the discussion of the performance standards. Right. So we can't start it before 8:05. My suggestion is that we start. Right. We can't start our hearing before 8:05, but we don't have to start it at 8:05. No, it's fine. If the town board wants to do performance standards first, we can do that. It'll just keep Mr. Musial waiting for a little while. I don't think he minds. Would you guys rather start with the public hearing? I'm fine with that too. Okay, fine. I'm going to make a motion to open our public hearing on performance standards. Do I have a second? I'll second. From Valentine, all in favor say aye. So let me just briefly indicate the materials we're working with here and the scope of this hearing. Nobody signed in, but there's a couple of familiar faces. Hopefully someone will be here to respond a bit in a preliminary fashion anyway. First of all, I want to thank Vicky in particular, and also Alan and Dennis Michaels. I'm going to leave someone out, I'm sure. Sander Bonville, the town board, for supporting the hiring of Sander Bonville in the process. This is a work in progress, but we wanted to set a hearing and give ourselves a deadline and get something on the table in general terms, although nothing is simple with the town code, I think, as we've all found out. There is some low-hanging fruit, and the low-hanging fruit we identified is within the arena of performance standards codes for industrial processes, machinery, and so on. There are certain metrics that are used for measuring compliance, and we noticed that some of those metrics are very, very old, and nothing against things that are old, but in some cases they've actually gone out of use for the kinds of technologies or processes that they're supposed to be useful for regulating. And so what we did was we worked with Sander and the others I just mentioned, and we looked at 3 or 4 areas where the standards for measurement could be amended. And it did get us into some other areas related to process as well. And Dennis very nicely provided some clarifications and amendments related to how performance standards reviews take place. And so I'll ask you in a minute to address that with the town board. But just for starters, just as quickly present this, and you'll all have to read this at your leisure and then come back together. in a few weeks to continue the hearing. But under smoke, you know, there's some new distinctions being made and a new measuring tool. There's a background document here which provides Sanders and others explanation as to why the proposed amendments make sense versus the other older metrics that were in use. So, for example, with smoke, there's a thing called the Ringelmann's smoke chart, and also EPA Method 9, and so he introduced those standards into the revised code, along with some language related to kind of what triggers a violation. The question of smoke and related matters of dust, fumes, vapors, gases, and so on, he introduced a distinction between those which originate in combustion processes, those versus others that might come from somebody just sort of pounding on something and making dust rise. So there are different kinds of emissions. And then you get to noise, where there's an updating of the standards for measuring compliance from one which was really outdated, and some discussion in the background on the properties of sound waves and human perception and what kind of constitutes sort of a damaging or annoying noise, and some questions related to how it's measured. And so there's information in there. And then moving on from noise, we get to odors, which of course has been an area of intense scrutiny of late, with the Aloof factory and perhaps others emitting odors which are obnoxious in the community, and there's a whole history with that. This particular set of amendments is not tackling, you know, Aloof in particular, but looking to see how our odor code can be improved in general. Perhaps some people might want to use Aloof as a kind of a case study or not, but the purpose of this code revision is to make it possible for our code enforcers, overseen by Jane Slavin, who's here, who I'd like to invite to speak as well, to actually measure odor in a way that's sort of agile and relatively objective. So there's description there for that. And then getting on to Dennis's, with the thing that he was focused on, which is basically procedures and enforcement, and how that review would take place in a way that makes sense. So that's the outline of it. Maybe the best thing to do, I think I've summarized the parts that Sander provided to us well enough, but I'd like to ask Dennis to speak to the procedure and enforcement aspect, because there are a lot of revisions here, but many of them are more in the area of clarification and kind of anticipating areas of ambiguity or confusion, but some of them I think you would want to highlight in terms of their substance.
In addition to clarifications and strengthening language that was already there, and clarifying language that's already there, and cleaning up some grammar, which I can't help myself. The meat of it is really in, if you jump to page 3 of my proposed amendments, 4.13 A and B, as you can see, everything that's underlined is new language. It's fairly extensive. If I can summarize, it's really to put meat on the bones of the procedures and the steps and the powers that our building department and our environmental management department will have, that they may not, or I will say they probably don't already have. If they do have some of these powers, it's not crystal clear. There's some loose ends. It doesn't have the meat on it that I, as a prosecutor or whoever may be prosecuting or investigating, going out into the field and taking the steps necessary to lay the groundwork for a viable prosecution, laying out the tools, the legal provisions that would enable our code enforcement officers, our building inspectors, or our expert consultants which also is now very crystal clear in here, that not only does the Zoning Board of Appeals have the power to hire expert consultants to guide the Zoning Board of Appeals, but Office of Building, Zoning, and Planning does, Environmental Management and Engineering does, Building Inspector does, and add that expense to the industrial user. So that's the meat of it in 14, and really that's reflected throughout the bulk of my revisions, has to do with the strengthening, clarifying, and laying forth the procedural powers and jurisdictional authority to not only investigate and to conduct testing, which would be part of those investigations, but also what are the teeth, the prosecutorial remedies for if there is a finding of a violation of the performance standards. So that summarizes the amendments that I'm proposing. And it is a work still in progress. I understand that the town board may be hiring an expert law firm, which is a great idea, that I don't think they're specifically being considered to be hired, but they might want to share this with that law firm and see if they have some suggestions as far as the prosecutorial mechanisms that would hold muster in a court to empower us to stop abuses of our performance standards. I would invite any experts' input, but this is my best crack at it. Again, it's still a work in progress. Just sitting here, I caught a couple of typos, but I invite more substantive, constructive criticism from whatever source.
I just note that one of the provisions you've written in here that we discussed at length was creating a system by which each year
Oh, thank you, yes.
the
resume of operations.
the resume of operations, each
So we were.
business that has performance standards that have been reviewed would be charged with
Right,
updating them.
Right, a new requirement that's being proposed is not only does the initial applicant for performance standards approval have to complete and submit a resume of operations, which lists all the equipment that's involved in the activity that triggers the performance standards, but the process that's involved, what noise might be generated, what odors might be generated, so on and so forth. Mr. Bonville has revamped that resume of operations. That's not part of the package for this evening, and it does not need to be adopted by the town board as part of this public hearing, the resume of operations, the amended resume, because in our existing town code, the Zoning Board of Appeals actually has the ability to create and establish the form and substance of the resume of operations, actually in the existing code. So that's something that once Sander Bonville finalizes the resume of operations, then that will be sent to the Zoning Board of Appeals for them to review, and whether or not it has to be subject to a public hearing, I don't know off the cuff, but it doesn't matter, it's no big deal. Then the Zoning Board of Appeals would adopt the revamped resume of operations. And with the proposed new text amendment that Andy just brought up, is it has to be resubmitted each year. And if there are no change, it has to be submitted by a qualified not an expert, what are we calling this? A qualified responsible person at the industrial user's facility each year has to sign a certification that there have been no changes in the operations, the manufacturing processes, et cetera, since the initial performance standards resume of operation was submitted. So each year that certification has to be submitted by the industrial user. And if there are changes that differ from the initial or the last submission of the resume of operations, then they have to obviously submit a new resume of operations from scratch, so to speak. So that's something that's new that's going to be required on a yearly basis.
I'll just note that I think that the revised resume is going to make for some very interesting reading, because when you look at the old one, there's just some questions that are missing from it that this town board and the zoning board has struggled with earlier. it doesn't ask very directly, what are your emissions? It asks, what kinds of machinery do you have that might create emissions? So his detailed revision of that will help the zoning board and the planning board capture a fuller picture of processes and
Well, not the planning board.
excuse me?
Not the planning board.
Well,
Right now,
ultimately-
it's in the hands of the ZBA. For now.
And that's another question that remains to be tangled with is the idea that maybe some of these should be reviewed by a different board or whatever.
But I think that's a discussion you want to
Yeah.
put off for another day, which is certainly fine.
So that's, thank you, Dennis. And again, there's a fair amount of detail here the board will want to look at. I just want to bring up Jane for a minute, if you would, head of our building department and code enforcement, just to note anything that you think the board needs to have highlighted for them regarding these revisions. And
Good
then we'll
evening.
invite the public to speak after that.
I agree with most of what Dennis Michaels brought to your attention. I think that the improvements in the performance standards will help to have the clarity and responsibility between the departments and the boards specified, which is a great thing. With technology constantly changing, the revisions will help us to keep up with that. And the resume of operations will help with continued enforcement. Right now, we don't have that provision within our code. So if yearly, we have someone that has to sign on and say, yes, this is what we're still doing, or if there's changes, then that allows us to have another review. So as technology changes and as the processes changes within manufacturing, the resume of operations will help us to continue to review that, which we don't have that in our code right now.
Before you step down, I just wanted to draw the board's attention to the odor part just for a minute, because there's two really important words. This is on page 4 out of 5 and 5 out of 5. And the goal with this is to create a standard for odor compliance using an olfactometer. And I just wanted to describe that device quickly, because I don't know if everybody was here when we talked about it probably a year or so ago with members of the community. An olfactometer essentially takes the ambient air where you're smelling an odor and then dilutes it in half and then half again. And then at some point, the odor is so diluted that the person will no longer be able to smell it. And so the intensity of an odor is measured by how many dilutions it takes to get to the point where it's imperceptible to the human nose. And one of the things that we've learned is the human nose is a rather extraordinarily sensitive instrument, in some cases more sensitive than air sampling in the detection of odor-causing compounds in ambient air can be. And so you have situations where people smell things, but you can't actually find and measure them using the standard air sampling techniques. And so that's the olfactometer. And so one of the basic questions comes down to, well, what is a reasonable level of odor, acceptable versus not acceptable? And there are dimensions to that. Obviously, its intensity is one of them, but its frequency, its duration, in the nature of the odor and how objectionable it is. And so if you look at page 5, the way that where we got with this was to create a standard whereby there would be five dilutions. There are places that have, 4 or 3 even. We notice that an outlier is in Oakland, California, where they have 50, which basically means it can be extraordinarily stinky and pass muster. So setting that number, we asked Sander to give us a number which is commonly used. He gave us 5. The town board may want to use its discretion on that. And then we linked it also to the existence and frequency of community complaints. And so the criteria are, number 1, there's an objectionable odor if a town inspector or code enforcement officer says there's an objectionable odor based on their direct investigation. Number 2, or the town gets 2 kinds of information. One is a certain number of complaints from the community within a certain time period, and the other is the olfactometer use, the odor is still detectable even with 5 volumes of odor-free air diluting it. And so that's the proposed, go ahead, Tom, sorry.
I know there was some back and forth on this with Jane, myself, you, and Sander, and, you know, I could be wrong. My last understanding was that what would trigger there being an objectionable odor, and then what happens after that, when there is an objectionable odor is a town inspector, code enforcement officer detects an objectionable odor, or then you have the neighborhood complaints.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's the "and," which applies
There's
to
an
both.
and, which I want everybody to see. It's on page 5.
Right,
And it's
but-
just hanging out there.
That applies to both. So just a code enforcement officer, again, my understanding is just a code enforcement officer, building inspector alone, or just neighborhood complaints alone isn't enough. You need that "and," which is on the next
So
page.
this is why I brought this up, because, you know, there needs to be discussion on this, and it's not fully resolved.
Absolutely.
Our first cut at it was to say that you had to have both the detectability through 5 dilutions and a certain number of complaints. That's the "and." But then we were scratching our heads and thinking, well, what about a situation where there's an obnoxious odor, but there's no complaints because people haven't gotten around to it, they're on vacation, whatever it is, but the inspector detects it, you know? So that's the scenario that I'm
Right.
giving to you. You guys will figure out how to deal with it, but that's a scenario that really could happen.
I think it's a policy decision that you guys have to
Yeah.
decide. Is a code enforcement officer, building inspector alone saying this is an objectionable odor, is that enough to trigger a potential violation?
Right.
That's
And
a
when we know from
legislative-
talking with you.
legislative
that-
policy question.
That what you can sort of prosecute depends on the kind of how robust the substance of the violation kind of detection is. So clearly, I guess clearly anyway, an inspector saying, hey, there's something really objectionable there, is at one level of prosecutability. And then when you have the dilution and the community complaints, it's at a higher level as far as what you can do with that in court. But we didn't want to leave the inspector out there all by him or herself and unable to trigger an investigation even just because the number of dilutions or the community complaints weren't there. So please bear that just as something to take into account.
Well, the code enforcement officer, building inspector wouldn't need the community complaints. He would need the dilution test.
Yeah.
The empirical standard, we'll call
So
it.
that's something to figure out.
Yeah. Again, it's not
It's
my,
some edits on
it's not
there.
for me to
Yeah.
make that
Right.
decision. Yeah.
Andy, my understanding is as code enforcement official, if we see something or smell something or hear something, or we have the authority for which to develop the complaint. What will help back that up is the second page,
Yep.
which is actually the 5 dilutions.
I just wanted to make sure that the 5 dilutions thing didn't remove your authority to do something if it didn't survive 5 dilutions or you didn't have the complaints.
Right.
That's what I'm saying.
If I can also add at this point, I think it's important, since we're going through this process, the community complaints are very important to this process. And right now, the community complaints are going seriously to like 50 emails.
Right.
I'm trying to develop a way to track that, to create a database. However, if it's going all over my department, it's very hard to do that. So again, I ask again that everyone send those complaints to obzpae@orangetown.com, is now I can collect that data and try to develop a database that not only may help us develop a pattern of time and location. Right now, it's impossible to track because they're going everywhere. So again, I ask anybody who's watching to please focus in and send it to that email address so that we can specify our time and focus in on that particular email address to help facilitate, again, our new performance standards that are coming along.
Thank you for reminding us of that. And I can read our IT director's mind right now. And what he's thinking is the easiest way to do this is to have an online form where everybody fills it out, and then they can email it to people too if they want, but the data is collected in one place and logged that way. So I'm sure that tool can be set up so that all complaints dump into a little database and you're not chasing after emails.
Right,
in the same way.
and we've spoken, IT and I have spoken about ways to upgrade the system within the building department to facilitate these issues. So.
Yep, that sounds good. Thank you. So that, in a nutshell, is where we're at. I'm going to stop describing it because it's there for you guys to read. Do you have any questions or comments for any of the town staff right now, or should we invite public comment? Okay. Nobody signed in, so by a raise of hands, is anybody here to speak on the question of the performance standards? A hand up. Yes, sir.
Good evening, John Curran, Sive Pageant and Roselle PC on behalf of API Industries. Given all the discussion here tonight, I understand that, as Mr. Michaels acknowledged, these are a work in progress, but just for the record, I want to object to any consideration of these measures tonight on the basis that proper procedure wasn't followed in terms of notice. Specifically, Town Code Section 25-2 requires that the text of any proposed amendment be posted on the signboard outside the clerk's office at least 3 days ahead of the hearing. And given the fact that these amendments were completed today, they could not have been posted 3 days ahead. So any consideration of these amendments is procedurally improper. And we also just want to demand an opportunity to come back for a hearing and actually be heard.
We agree with you that we need to have a continuation of the hearing, and a proposal would be to do that on January 9th. And
Okay.
would value your specific input on the codes at that time.
Great. Thank you.
Do you have anything else specific to your last-minute reading of these things that you didn't have a chance to really look at?
No.
Okay.
I have something to say about the next thing that's going to be considered on the agenda. You want me to speak to that now, or just wait till it comes up?
No, we're just doing the performance standard right now, so let's
Okay.
stick to that.
Terrific.
Thank you, though. Stick around. Anybody else for a comment? Yes, Heather?
Good evening, Town Board. Heather Hurley. I must say it's probably the only time I will agree with counsel for API, but I do agree that the public should be given more of a chance to look at a draft prior to 2:30 today, when there is a public hearing for this amendment that is so important. Just a couple of things. I really haven't had a chance to look through it, and I know it's just a draft, so I appreciate that this will be continued to January 9th. And hopefully the public comment portion will also be remained or be kept open until that period. Regarding enforcement, are there any provisions in here that any emissions that exceed the DEC New York State annual or short-term guideline concentrations would be subject to an immediate either shutdown or some sort of violation until mitigation to cease these exceeding chemical concentrations is completed? And this includes emissions that are elevated, that are carcinogens, that are currently identified in recent data air sampling. So that is something that, if that can also be looked into. Also in 10.335A, about the zoning board may engage or retain qualified experts. Can something be explored that says hired by the town at the expense of the industrial user? Is that also something that can be?
It's in there somewhere.
It is in there? Okay, thank you. Will any of the provisions that are included in here for enforcement be able to utilize state or federal violations that are issued to any industrial user in order to back pending litigation from the town? For example,
I don't want to interrupt you. Can you repeat that? I didn't.
oh, sorry. Okay, so will any of the provisions for the enforcement be able to utilize state or federal violations issued to any industrial user in order to back pending litigation that the town may be involved with? For example, any New York State DEC violations for air pollution control laws that are issued to an industrial user, can they be designated in here that that would also count for violations?
I believe so. I'm sorry, Ms. Redmond.
That's okay.
If you look at page 4 of my proposed amendments, it's proposed 14.13 paragraph B. So it's a new subparagraph, 4.13 subparagraph, paragraph B on my page 4.
Oh, okay.
And you'll see subparagraph, little Roman numeral 2. The industrial user's full and complete compliance with any and all laws, states, rules, and regulations the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, the Federal Environmental Protection Agency, that also regulate the use that is subject to performance standards, section 4.1. So to the extent that those federal or state regulations also regulate the same subject of the performance standards, those have to be complied with as part of the performance standards.
Okay. Okay, thank you. And then also the other, in 4.164, where it talks about fly ash, dust fumes, and so on, and then it says derived from combustion. Can that also include gasification, pyrolysis, and/or manufacturing? Because these are some of the technologies that are currently coming either into Rockland or into Orangetown. For example, Inelitech was a pyrolysis process. Gasification is what is going on at Stony Point, and currently the town of Orangetown has no protections in terms of prohibited uses in terms of these specific technologies. We've been working on this to try and get a ban for some of these processes, but that has not happened yet with the town board, so if that can also be included there. And also the last thing would be in the performance standards draft, 4.163, it says other than that caused by steam. I was just wondering who is determining to make sure that the steam emissions, if it is white steam, that it doesn't contain certain chemicals such as benzene or things like that, because Inelitech claimed that their emissions were only steam or water vapor and that they were going to be just white from pyrolysis, yet it was found out later on through foils that their emissions were actually going to contain things like benzene, toluene, methane, things like that. So that's just another point I just wanted to address for now. Thank you.
Thanks for those comments. And also just, I want to direct your attention to 4.164-2, where it also incorporates the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation's language. So in both of those spots, the amendments make reference, and the question is we just got to make sure that reference is appropriate, and the incorporated sections of the state or federal are sort of a good match with the local. Mr. Mandel, thank you.
Good evening, Supervisor Stewart, members of the Town Board, Michael Mandel, Pearl River. This is more, I guess, within the area of enforcement. I'm looking at the background information, and it talks about visible emission observation by qualified observers, and also we're going for the testing of odors. Are any of our town employees qualified to be observers, as stated in this, or to use the olfactometer? Will we be training any of our employees? If so, is it within our job description, within the union job descriptions? Or will the town hire outside consultant each and every time? Is it budgeted for in the next fiscal year if we're going to be hiring outside experts? If our code enforcement people are trained, we can start out based upon the complaints from the public or even their own observations. We can start out with solid evidence that we can use in the prosecution against these people rather than stringing this out.
And not to cut you off, but the answer is they can easily be trained. The devices are not expensive, and if the town board approves this standard for odor, the building department would obtain the devices and obtain the training. And the assumption is that it's part of the inspector's job description.
Certification that goes along
Yeah.
with, you can be certified.
This certification.
Right. Same with the visual emission observations.
Any of these tools are relatively
Well, it doesn't
inexpensive.
give a tool here. It just says visual emission observations by qualified observers, and that's on page 3 of the background information sheets, about 2/3 of the way down. So it says it's often serves as a primary compliance surveillance tool for enforcement of emission control standards. So that's what I was just asking, because we can put this whole policy ahead. If we don't have the enforcement set up and ready to go with it and certified by our employees that are going to go out there, then it's a useless thing, and it's just going to be running on and on and on. And we decide we have to hire outside consultants, and we have to have
Right,
a
that- what I'm
resolution
trying to
before the board
communicate-
to hire outside consultants. Then we
Right.
get the outside. So this drags on. We should be able to do this in a very timely manner. That's all my comments are
Yeah,
as far as it is.
And it's a useful clarification so folks know that the metrics under consideration here are within the capability of our staff, given the proper certification and the device. In the case of an olfactometer or the Ringelmann scale is literally a card with different kind of gradations
Right.
of darkness of smoke on it. And these are trainings and tools which are not hard to obtain.
And I'm just saying, if this, all the changes are passed, there should be a resolution right after it that says that employees of the buildings department, code enforcement people, will be trained within the next 3 or 6 months so that we can have it, not have it drag on or come up with another resolution that we need this or that. So it's timeliness of prosecution. Thank you.
Thank you. By raise of hands, anybody else here to speak on the matter of the performance standards amendments? Town staff? We're all right for now?
The only thing I would say is that we probably, it says a town inspector code enforcement.
Which one are you on?
4.182, to enforce this performance standard, objectionable odors will be considered detected in a violation of the section 4.182 when either a town inspector / code enforcement officer, I would probably want to add like DEC officer or DEC employee, because we have talked with the DEC and they said they would be sending out field officers to help us with detecting odors, so we probably would want to add that to that provision. That's it for now.
I'm writing that in there. Maybe we just make it generic or another relevant agency or something. So
Yeah,
if the
something like that.
if the county health department ever reinstates their odor team, they'd be covered.
Any state, federal, or municipal.
Right.
Federal, state, municipal, field officer.
Something like that. Anything else, guys?
No, we're keeping this open, all right?
Yep. So on that, Dennis, were you about to?
You have to issue your notice of intention to declare yourself lead agency under the state fire department. Did you already do it? Well, when? Oh, at a previous meeting? Okay, thanks. Well, then you can declare yourself lead agency. No. No? Okay. There's no hurry. Doesn't have to be done.
So our next resolution would be to adjourn the public hearing to January 9th on the amendments proposed here.
And set a time to avoid further public notice.
Maybe 8:05. How's that sound? What's that? At 8:05. I'll make a motion for that. Do I have a second over here? Jerry, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
The ayes have it. Okay, so back to Town Hall. Thank you for that reminder. Mr. Musial and Mr. Lane. We missed you last time around. Thanks for coming. And does the town board have the revised report? I know we sent it around. Vicki, is that revised report in our packet, or did you guys come with copies? Okay, good. All right, so Larry's got it.
Okay.
Nothing else on there.
Is it good? Just stand over here.
With the mic.
So what we're looking at tonight is a kind of a summary review of recommended layout for a kind of a concept for a town hall and the cost-benefit comparison of various options, including a kind of a rebuild, reuse, stay where you are scenario, and also a couple of scenarios where the building department and associated facilities would be consolidated on this site. The Rockland Psych Center site clocks in at substantially more money, so I think that's off the table as far as building a whole new police department over there and everything else. So we're really looking to hear about kind of the pros and cons of the various, first the kind of the comparison of rebuild to build new. And I realize rebuilding involves a lot of new, and building new involves some of the old as well. But there is a distinction to be made, largely in the fact that the rebuild leaves the building department over there with its own kind of rebuild necessities. So I think that's where we're at. So if you could just do numbers first to show us more or less, the relative cost, so we can take some options off the table, and then.
I think Larry will proceed with it. I think we'll go through quickly the first part of it, Mr. Supervisor, and then get into the nuts and bolts. But we have one more step after this, but basically this is the nuts and bolts of the report.
Sounds good.
So we thank you, and I'll turn it over to Larry to get into it further.
Well, this is building on to, there were two other presentations that we submitted. The very first one was the program, and that's where we broke down 7 different schemes, which I'll review again real quick, so we'll know what we're comparing on cost and tonight. There was also discussion, as the supervisor mentioned, that we may keep this building and refurbish it. So there was a report done with this, which is also combined to this presentation that I'd like to share with you tonight. So let's begin. So we're going to review the design concepts. There are over 7 schemes plus 3 schemes that involve renovating this building, and we'll compare the costs. And of course, we have the 3 sites. The one in the middle is where we are, and the one on the far right is where the library is, and also where the building department and the fire prevention department is. And then to the left is the RPC, so it's somewhat along the same line. This is what we're working with. We're working with 2 buildings. We call it Building A and Building B. The Building A is what we're in today, and that's on the bottom rectangle. And the blue is Building B. That's where the court room is, and where the clerk is, and where the police headquarters is. Scheme 1 would be having a new building built diagonally in front of this building. And that building could be built, for the most part, while this building is still occupied. And then there would be another phase in order to connect the new building to the Building B that would remain. And we are keeping in mind that there is the promenade that was proposed by previous folks, and doing that, we can actually use this Scheme 1 to be the backstop, be the fanfare, be the recipient of the promenade from east to west along the main thoroughfare. Early phase on Scheme 1, remember, would be building that building, the cyan building, where the yellow building is the Building A that we're in, and it would remain until the cyan building is built. Then this building would be demolished, and there would have to be some temporary office space, or not move the building department fire prevention in until this additional connection is built. And then that connection might house not only the atrium for public to enter into this new complex, combined complex, but also would have the judges' chambers to the far right. which is where they are today. And this breaks down how the departments can be placed. And this is a plan of how the parking would be affected around there.
And it involves 2 floors on the western.
That is
addition.
correct. Yes, it would, with this scheme, we're proposing to not go down and excavate. It would have one level that has the entrance, and it also has the IT and various pieces, this replacement of this room, and then upstairs would be more the building department and the fire prevention. The scheme 2 would be to build on top of this and add on to that. I'm sorry, scheme 2, I apologize. That's on the other side of building B. It would be taking up the space for the parking for the police. And it also involves, there's an antenna in the way. There were a lot of obstacles with scheme 2, and it's not advised, so we did not elaborate on that study. It's just not a very feasible scheme. And scheme 3 was also not so feasible, and that was to build on top of this building. Well, the structure of this building is having some trouble, and it would be quite extensive to leave this building and build on top, or actually to demolish it and build it on that same site. Now, scheme 4 was nicknamed the bookend, and that would be, this one has a lot of merit in that we could build this building while building A stays occupied. And then once this is built, everyone can be moved over there, and then this building can be demolished. And it would look somewhat like this. And broken down with this, 2 floors and an atrium that goes all along the joining buildings. So the facade of the building B would end up being an interior facade, and it would be connected to this new bookend building. This right here would take up some parking along there, but it allows for somewhat of a courtyard, outdoor courtyard, towards the front.
Larry has glossed over these because it's hard to read, but we have included in the report the pros and cons of each of the schemes.
Right.
After this.
And there's an example of that. Now, building 5 turned out to be not a very feasible solution, because in order to have the square footage that we needed to have in this whole complex by bringing all the departments over, we would need to build 2 floors on top of the existing building B behind us. The structure is not, to my knowledge, ready to receive that type of load, and there would be a lot of disturbance from all departments. In fact, the building, everyone in the who occupies building B would have to vacate the building during this process. So there's a lot of negative, a lot of cons towards doing this. So we did not elaborate that in that scheme. As the supervisor mentioned, we also discussed building a brand new complex at the RCP, and you'll see in this breakdown of cost comparisons that became quite expensive to do. It also pushes the center of Town Hall further to the edge of this area as opposed to more centrally located. Now, scheme 7 has a lot of merit. In fact, it is a hybrid of what we saw with building 1, which was a fanfare, and then also it combines the bookends of scheme 4. So it has best of both worlds. And this has 3 floors as opposed to 2 that scheme 4, the bookends, had 2. This one has 3 to allow for more parking in that area, and it also it lends to different levels and tiers. You can see also how the building, if we were to see it in the plan, the purple, see how it actually is offset in front of building B. And that allows for us to subdivide that front part to be used for this space that can be accessible to the public after hours. So this has a lot of merit into this, and more parking than the others as well. Now the breakdown, we're not going to be able to read this too well on here. I'd be happy to go through each one of the line items if you have some questions on that. But what it is showing are all the schemes, and to compare the cost. And to make it a little easier, there's also a chart on the next page, and you can see that there's somewhat of a straight line of the estimated cost, except for where the RPC would be involved with building a new building. The reason why that one scheme, which is Scheme 6, is so much more expensive is that's where we were bringing the police department and the town hall to the RPC site. Whereas on the far right, we would build a permanent pre-engineered building at the RPC to only house the folks that office and here temporarily until what is built, or until this area is renovated, and then they would move back and leave a vacant pre-engineered metal building for future use. Would you like to? Yeah. So the next steps is basically to get your input, and once you decide, and I can be happy to answer the questions you have, once you decide which scheme you'd like, our office would like to develop that one scheme into more of a conceptual plan, showing more of the walls and doors and windows to see how it might really look on that site.
Just to remind myself, did we already pay for that? Like that, the elaboration of a preferred scheme?
We're going to do that within the fee that.
Right, okay. So that's a continuation of the current
Yes.
project,
Yes.
gotcha.
Yes, that's true. I'm sorry.
I'm just looking at some of the caveats on the cost estimates. I know there's a couple of items that were hard to calculate on page 33. As we're looking at this handy bar chart, scenarios that involve renting swing space.
Right.
You know, the calculations of rent increases, utility cost calculation. I would assume that would be, I guess that question was sort of an optimization thing, but a new building is cheaper to heat, right?
It'd
And so
certainly be more energy.
there's some
efficient.
carrying cost benefit.
Right.
You've spent your big dollars on, but then operating costs. And are you saying this kind of whole calculation is based on how much it costs to build the building? To what extent are you talking to us about operational cost of these different scenarios? Is that
We really haven't.
that's not really part of the calculation,
We
right?
haven't really touched upon that.
Okay.
No.
Do you think those operational cost questions, I mean, they're not sort of significant enough, I guess, to discriminate between one option or another? I mean,
I would doubt it.
Right. You will have the operation cost for whatever scheme you have, and it will be pretty
Right.
much the
and
same.
including the reuse of Old Town Hall would include upgrades to HVAC and stuff that would gain us certain efficiencies anyway.
That's
So
true.
that it's sort of an apples to apples
That's
when it
correct.
comes to operating costs.
Yes, Supervisor, that's
And
true.
one of the things that came up as we talked about this reuse option, which the town board really wanted to know, like what's the cost of sort of staying here but fixing everything up, is the accommodation of the codes for ADA, for the Americans with Disabilities Act, would require more generous space for doorways and bathrooms and things like that. And we actually end up with a difficult to quantify situation where you rebuild to code and you actually lose some space in terms of workspace to the space needed for passage
We came
with
up
an
with a square,
indeterminate cost.
we came up with a square foot to work with that. And
Okay.
the way we did that is we know how much square foot that the town needs for all the departments that would be housing the space. And we also know that if we were to keep this building, we have about 21,000 square feet. And we also know the square feet of the building B. And there is a net difference that was left over after looking at what is really needed for ADA and all the other upgrades. And that came out to be about 5,000 square, I'm sorry.
That's this little chart on page 33.
That's
Yeah.
Where
correct.
basically you figured out that we'd need about 5,000 feet of office somewhere.
Yes.
If we fix up this building and lost some space to the ADA. And then you calculated the cost of that over 20 years at roughly $4 million. And so that's just
Yes.
an additional consideration.
That's how we came up with
Right.
that.
Anything you guys want to ask these?
No, so the next thing you're waiting for is town board to make a selection of the 7 schemes that you presented.
Yes.
And then we'll take that and put it into more of a conceptual scheme where you can physically see how the rooms are gonna lay out.
You have 10 schemes listed here, what are they?
Some of them weren't usable.
We had 7 schemes, and then 3 more was for this. And those 3 involved, all those 3 were to remodel this one. One of them was to use temporary office trailers on the site. Now, it mainly is, what are we going to do with employees in this building while this is being renovated? And there were 3 solutions for that. So putting temporary trailers was one. Another one was to build a building that would house them in RPC, that's 2. And the other one was, I believe, to rent space elsewhere.
Yeah, we got rental cost numbers from Blue Hill Plaza for one thing.
Right.
And so all of the scenarios that would require people moving out, that was calculated. And then there are scenarios that don't require people moving out, one of which is your
Number
recommended
7.
scheme, 7, where you're building new stuff and people are moving into it and then you're demolishing the old.
Would be the same one.
And 4 too,
Four
yes, sir.
similar, yeah.
That's right.
So 4 and 7 don't require
Anybody
moving out.
The building is complete.
One, wait a minute here.
Some work to be done later on, but hopefully that's everybody out.
You're exactly right.
I don't think that the board should underestimate the kind of amount of aggravation and potential for absorbing everybody's time and energy of repeated moves. And if the board can find a solution that avoids that, everybody's life's gonna be a lot easier.
Are they looking for an answer tonight, Andy? Because I've been looking at this, Vicky had sent it to us.
It's really a question for the town board. Would the town board like to move a scenario tonight, or you want to kind of consider your options and? Yeah, that would be my thought as well.
Okay.
Maybe you, but I would love to hear your thoughts.
If I had, I've went through this a few times, and if I had my scheme that I would select, it would be scheme 4, where you leave the old building here until the bookend, pretty much with an entry in the middle. It looks to me like it would be the best fit for the town. And since we've already paid for them to do, for their including, the conceptual plan, we should definitely pick one and move forward with that, to at least get to that point.
Oh, I agree completely. I'm also hearing.
Everybody
yeah.
should have a chance to look at this stuff
Yeah.
and review it.
I just want to point out to,
Scheme would be in scheme 4, that the court is in building B. You have an atrium that goes across, right now, the court clerk's office, and everybody is right behind. Where would that fit into the same building?
we would propose where the clerk is today would move to the new building. And then the judges might then be where the clerk is, so they would be right across the hall and attached closer to the courtroom.
So the judge would walk through the atrium and get back and forth?
No, they'll be in the same
No, they would be in
building.
building B.
They will be in building, okay.
Yeah, they'll be in
Yeah.
where Charlotte's office is now. She moved to the new building. And the judges should move into Charlotte's office.
If I could point out something real quick, is 4 is a good scheme, I'll have to admit. I will have to say 7, in my view, is better than 4. And the reason is that there's more parking that's available. From our estimation, there's at least 10 more slots in 7 than there is in 4. There's also
Cheaper, too.
there's just there's also the skewing of having the building project out from the rest of the area allows for the backstop, which is what we were trying to do with Scheme 1, and it has the bookends that Scheme 4 has. It has also 3 levels instead of 4. Scheme 4 has 2 levels.
Mm-hmm.
Scheme 7 has 3. And the advantage of having 3 is that also architecturally it allows for the roof lines to be a little bit more similar to the building B. Whereas if a building 4, it's going to be quite lower.
Larry, do you remember, I'm trying to find out why it is that Scheme 7 with its 3 floors is about $750,000 cheaper than Scheme 4 with its 2 floors? Like, what are the less excavation? Oh, Jane, great, yeah.
I was just about to say, I think Scheme 7 is probably more cost-effective in that you have less excavation, less foundation work, the roof line, tying everything in, creates a better visual. My question also would be, is LEED certification being considered? And is there any type of government, federal monies that could help offset some of the costs with the LEED certification, as we are concerned, obviously, with energy efficiency long-term? And having a smaller footprint in a tighter building will help you achieve that faster.
Yeah, you want to address any of this?
Well, I think just the nature of it being the geometry of a narrower bar, you have a shallower floor plate that allows for light penetration and things like that. Yeah, that's one of the attributes of 7 that is more beneficial than 4.
These costs consider LEED, but it does not consider the LEED application because the U.S. Green Building Council requires fees for your application. They're minimal for a project of this nature. So I think it'd be up to the board to decide whether they want to actually apply for LEED certification or LEED rating. But the fee to U.S. Green Building Council would have to be built into this, but it's in the overall scope of things. It isn't a heck of a lot of money.
Yeah, the big difference, I guess, between 4 and 7 is one building's skinnier and taller.
Yeah,
That's right.
So
Right.
instead of putting it on the side and putting it on top.
Well, in a
I
long,
like that concept of it being built next to it while everybody's still here.
yes,
Yes.
yes, yeah.
How do the rooms fit out in the narrower building?
One thing that, can we go back to this? Here?
This one?
Go back to one? The plan?
So I'm going in the wrong direction. Hit the wrong- There we go.
This right here is where we're standing right now, we're sitting right here. This is the meeting room, whereas this area is all closed off and can be secured during off hours. Whereas you have entrances coming through here to go in this way, but you can go directly in from a monumental plaza, also to be used for the events that are done for 9/11 and various events that already take place over here. So this also lends to not only the backdrop of the promenade, but it also lends to having a 24/7, 365 space that the Scheme 4 could also have, but it's designed to actually receive that type of use a little bit better.
some of the things to be considered would have to temporarily, when the, if this building is kept, you have some mechanical equipment on that side that's going to have to be relocated temporarily to allow this to be constructed. So that's another one of the issues, but it's not a big deal.
You guys, in your drawing of scheme 7, it looks like the one on page 28, and I realize it's conceptual, the purple bar seems to stick out more
Oh, sorry.
than the blue does on the earlier page.
Yes, it does.
And obviously, it's schematic. One of the questions I had is about the atrium, and I think, we all know what an atrium is. And but what is the point of it? I mean, what can you do in there? Like, if you're kind of a lean and mean, how productive is this space kind of question?
Yeah.
Like, what do you do with an atrium?
You hold meetings in it.
Okay, so
You
it's a
have
meeting
different
space?
functions going on. Matter of fact, we did a school. We did a school.
Palm trees?
We did a school about 5 years ago that had a large common space, and the Board of Education decided they liked it so much, that's where they were going to hold their meetings.
Interesting.
So it kind of evolves into, you find a use.
It's a multi-use type space.
Yeah. And you were saying something?
Oh, just the nature of it.
Does it also give you windows on both sides?
Exactly.
Yes.
So for people who like having windows.
Right.
It's light coming into the building.
That's right.
Yeah, no, that's right. I just think that for the town board, choosing which option to get developed is a really important decision. And we certainly want to hear from engineering, from building department, from town staff, people who would actually be living in this building and working in it. And I was wondering if you have any sort of guidance to how to choose. I know what you recommend. No, I mean, in terms of collecting the input of the various folks whose opinion really matters here.
Well, like we're showing in this scheme, I think the building department is downstairs.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe the building department doesn't want to be downstairs.
No, we want to be on the roof.
Well, that's actually a really important point, and we haven't really gotten into the. Yeah,
And that's the purpose.
I'm going on the assumption that the allocation of space within this box is flexible. In other
Yes.
words, you choose a scenario, but you're not necessarily choosing a layout. But to some degree, you may be, and so knowing.
We did do a very quick diagram of adjacencies of spaces and how certain departments like to be closer to other departments, or others do not need to be so close. And so that was taken into account of when this was placed, but there is some flexibility.
So I guess I would want to know is if you've proposed a kind of office space organization based on those adjacent values for each one. I'm wondering how much of that kind of proposal is sort of locked in with the overall design, or is it entirely flexible within the design? Because then we don't have to worry about it. We can just look at the footprint.
It's just total square feet, and you
Right.
put them where
You put them wherever you want. They're like pieces of puzzle. Okay. Except for that one where you were suggesting the purple bar have a meeting space down at the end, which is kind of an obvious use of that space. Okay, so we have total flexibility. So when we're considering options, we're really looking at footprint and overall structure, and not worrying about, where the different departments go so much.
But
Okay.
in your discussions, I think you need to bear in mind parking, because that's always an issue.
Right.
And how we deal with those few times a year when you have overflow parking, how is that dealt with? Those kind of things.
Right. Another question?
With the difference between the narrow and the thicker, always effective, or, layouts of offices, you said you lay out offices anyway, but it's not gonna be, once you go to that third floor, you're gonna come in and would you have, I guess what I'm asking is how wide is the narrow building, how wide is the wider building?
You know, I cannot, it's about, the narrow building is about,
Offices are gonna come off a hallway somewhere, I would
Right.
imagine.
as far as circulation goes, to answer that part, is that we were taking account of 25 to 30% of what is needed for this, for that department, square footage wise. So where the corridors go, the square footage is provided, where it goes is flexible. And as far as the width of the 7 versus, well, the scheme 4, the width of the scheme 4 is the same as the width of the building B, the one that's existing. That's right. It's almost a mirror image of the footprint. It's a little larger in square footage, but not much. And the narrow one is about 2/3, if I recall right. I would have to double check.
But you may not need a corridor down the center, as shown here, because the narrow building, the green, might very well be the corridor, and that's one department to the rear, and another department to the front, and then you have the atrium as your circulation space to get there. The atrium becomes circulation space.
But your atrium would only be on the first floor, you still have going, you're
Yeah,
going 2
true.
above that.
Yeah, but you might have a monumental stair, you might have, depends on your
Balcony.
location of your elevator and how that works out, you know?
Yes, ma'am.
And coming late to this ballgame, but has a specific client program been developed, the specific uses for each department?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so do we have a bubble diagram
Yes.
showing? All right, so I haven't seen that yet, but I think that'll help with what the questions
And
that
square
the board is
footage
asking.
allocations.
Is that a bubble diagram will talk about the adjacencies and the actual square footages needed for those relationships versus just, okay, you could put it here, or put it here, or put it here. So that is actually the next step
This is the adjacency,
that I understand,
and
is that we
then
would
all of the square
implement
footages are right here.
the specific requirements for each department to develop that bubble diagram, to get an idea of the actual adjacencies.
Right,
Yes.
and we have gone through that, and we do have those square footages, and we do have those adjacencies.
But has
So-
that been presented?
Oh,
to the
sure,
board?
Yes.
Okay,
yes,
perfect.
yeah.
The first
That,
report,
yeah, that was the first report, right.
Okay.
That was a long time
Well, I
ago.
have to go back a couple of presentations.
We can send that to you, you know.
Yeah, no, you should definitely go through all that stuff. Key player. It's nice having an architect on staff. You want to, are you saying put together a, are you talking about staff meeting or town board meeting? Absolutely. Okay. So,
And I think it would help.
Quite honestly, we didn't expect to leave here tonight with any direction.
course not,
We kind
yeah.
of figured you're going to need to.
so we're going to plan a follow-up meeting for the town board to consult with town
Sure.
staff, work it over and get you on an agenda soon.
Fine.
Okay.
That'd be great.
Thank you, this was very well.
Thank
All
you.
right, thank you
Thank you.
very much, appreciate it. Everyone have a wonderful holiday, please. Thank you.
Before I forget,
Do you want to put a meeting next week and put a resolution on for the 19th? It seems we can do that.
well, I think let's have our meeting and see where the town board gets as far as choosing a scenario. And then we can always, if we want to do new business, do that. Just before I forget, thank you very much, guys.
Thank you.
For anybody who is coming on the performance standards public hearing, or might be watching this later on YouTube, prior to the January 9th meeting, we're going to invite Sandra Bonville, our environmental chemist, to present on January 9th to help with the continued public hearing. Prior to that meeting, say between 7 and 8, he'll be available, and anybody who'd like to meet with him is welcome to do so. Just a FYI. We'll let folks know about that. All right, so that's that. The next item would be item number 3, which is air monitoring proposal TRC Solutions. And this is, the suggestion is for this to be a vote tonight. It is the approval of odor modeling related to the aloof odor study and the charging of API Industries for that consultation. I'll make a motion to approve this resolution. Do you have a second? Over here. From Dennis Troy, all in favor, say aye. Aye. The ayes have it. Number 4, also for consideration tonight, we were going to have a public comment actually on this, and I don't see that on here. Yeah, we were going to have, so one of the items that we are having tonight is the CSEA contract, and one of the things we were going to do is invite anybody who might come. We were making an accommodation of Councilman Troy, who can't be here on December 19th, by having a vote at a workshop meeting, and we promoted it as an opportunity for folks to speak on the matter. I see Ronnie is here, a prominent member of our bargaining unit. There may be others here as well who want to speak about the CSEA contract. So I'd like to make a motion that we accept public comment about this item. I have a second for Tom Divany. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Would anybody here like to speak about the contract? Not seeing any raised hands. Make a motion to close that public comment period. Jerry will second. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Let's have it. And then I'll make a motion to approve the CSEA contract, and the details of which have been attached in the backup. I will say that I think there's a little something in there for everybody as far as improvements to the contract for the purposes of cost efficiency, particularly with the payroll system. And obviously, there's pay raises for members of the union, which are significant. And it seems to me, anyway, although there's no perfect contract to have resolved certain issues that I, anyway, as a town manager, really wanted to see fixed. And I appreciate the work that Jeff from finance, and Teresa, obviously, town attorney, and John and others, the department heads that were consulted early in the process to kind of highlight items that are important operationally, including, for example, the using clocks and computers for people to log in, so we can start to save a little time and run around related to accounting for hours worked. Items like that really do make a difference for town management, and we're appreciative of the work that went into that. And I know that Ronnie and her colleagues with the CSEA, there's always some skepticism or suspicion with operational changes, and that there might be a consequence, either intended or unintended, and it need to be considered thoroughly. And I believe that there was a thorough consideration of several matters, and I'm glad to have the cooperation on some of them anyway, so that we have a contract that I can support. So I will make a motion to support this resolution. Second from Jerry. I suggest any other comments at this time, and then maybe a roll call vote.
What?
Do you want to say something?
No.
No, I see you put your thing.
No.
Yeah, I'll make a quick comment. While I appreciate all the hard work that went into this contract, sometimes I think, or I wish, that the officers of the CSEA who negotiated this would sometimes just be more open to working with the town on things that don't actually cost the employees money, like the lag. I mean, because in real world, can anybody ever imagine getting paid before you work? Like, you get paid on Monday for the week before you worked it, and then the finance department had to adjust it to what actually worked. I mean, it's unbelievable to me that wouldn't just be something that was taken care of. But I appreciate them taking care of it. And other things like the time clocks. I mean, in real life, if your employer says we're going to start using time clocks, you use time clocks. It's not something that needs to be negotiated. In government world, it's something that needs to be negotiated. Even though the majority of the town already uses time clocks, we couldn't get everybody to use time clocks unless it was agreed upon. So I appreciate them agreeing upon that. But I'm absolutely supporting the contract because I appreciate the hard work of the men and women of our town. And I think we have some really good stand-up employees. And I'm hoping that the CSEA will start now coming with recommendations on the way that the town can perform better, and work with us, because most of them are residents. And they also pay taxes as well as live here, and we could all work together to find ways to be more economical for all of us, for ourselves, for our neighbors, for our friends, for the CSEA employees, and for the residents. If they would come with some recommendations on things that we can do as a town to save money so that it's not just on one side but on both sides, I think that would be really appreciated. And I appreciate the hard work that went into negotiating this contract. So I'm in favor of it.
Any other comments, folks? Can we have a roll call vote? Roll call vote?
On a roll call, Supervisor Stewart,
Yes.
Councilman Vittori,
Yes.
Councilman Troy,
Yes.
Councilman Valentine,
Yes.
and Councilman Divney.
Yes.
Thank you, Charlie. The next item, item number 5, traditionally follows the approval of a CSEA contract, and that is the proposal from the town board at its discretion to treat non-union employees similarly in the payroll system. And so this resolution number 5, it resolves that all employees with job titles that are specifically itemized below that are excluded from the CSEA would receive the same salary increases in it, and there's a list there, down through there. So I'll make a motion for this. Do I hear a second from over here? From Tom Divney, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
The ayes have it. That, I think, completes items for voting
No, I think there's another one.
tonight. Oh, there's another one in there. Okay, well, so we'll get
Something,
there. Oh, I see, yeah, the tax cert. All right.
Tax cert.
So let's just go down through. The next one, number 6, received from Tom Divney today, or maybe earlier, we talked about today, was to hire outside counsel on the question of regulation and litigation of compliance with environmental and industrial standards, and it names a proposed counsel. I've just put in a blank space.
John,
A lot of
what
times
did
we
you
do
say, 30?
fees not to exceed.
Not to exceed 30,000, 35,000? 35,000.
Did I say 35? Okay, so that would be a workshop item. Any questions, comments, or concerns about that one?
I would just say not to exceed 35,000 and just take out in 2008, because we may want to get
Okay.
them in. Because Dennis did suggest that we get them our proposed performance standards, and maybe they can come in with comments.
So start before 2018.
Yep.
So, and perhaps, who knows, 2019. Okay, so there's that one. Number 7, from Finance, we don't have the specific language yet, but we did have a bit of an informal email back and forth on this. I think the town board members are familiar with it. It has to do with defeasing outstanding bond. Do the town board members want our finance director just to describe this briefly?
It was pretty clear in
Okay.
the
clear. I
email.
feel like it was
unless you
pretty
wanted to
clear.
Explain it to the public, but
It's
I think
basically,
everybody had the same feeling. Go with Jeff's recommendation.
Yeah, we appreciate your
we're
recommendation on
going to
that.
take money from the sale and
the
pay off the bond. It's pretty simple.
It's also required, because municipal law.
Jeff, if you could just come up to the microphone for a minute, I appreciate it. It's actually a nice thing to tell people about.
So what we're doing here is, obviously, the town took out a bond, a couple bond anticipation notes in 03, 04, 05, 06, and then it culminated in a bond in 2008 to purchase the RPC lands. That's a municipal bond. It has to be used for municipal purposes. So the town needs to pay off that bond since it has now sold the land to J.P. Morgan Chase for $7.5 million. We refunded that bond in 2015, and so that bond is callable in 10 years, so that would be 2025. So what we have to do in order to defease the bond is we have to hire an escrow agent, put the money into escrow, and they will make the payments. That will get the debt off of our balance sheet. So it's roughly $3.6 million, and that's what we need to do.
Okay. So we'll have the detailed resolution for that
All right.
for next meeting. Thanks, Jeff. There's a received file of documents from the town clerk's office.
Hearing officer.
There's a hearing officer appointment for a disciplinary matter. There's a contract for software solutions. Usually, yeah, it's for the fire inspectors, I think.
Yes.
Yep. There are caretaker agreements for the homes that the town owns that are occupied by town employees with specific agreements about rent and maintenance. There's several of those. There's an MOU with the New York Sharks related to pool use.
And you have
There's number 14, which is time sensitive, and this is the approval of settlement of a tax certiorari, and it lists the business involved and the amount of money. Thank you to Dennis Michaels for putting this resolution together. Would someone like to make a motion to approve it?
moved.
You're from Divany, second from Troy. All in favor, say aye. The ayes have it. Number 15 is High Tor Animal Shelter, and they're, but the short story on that is that the county plans to finance a new shelter on site, and they're doing a better job, the shelter is, I think, of kind of describing what their business model is and allocating the costs based on number of animals and families served by town. And fortunately, although it's increased their ask to the towns, the hit for Orangetown is, I think it was $11,000 or $15,000 or something over what we've traditionally agreed to pay High Tor, from about $33,000 up to $49,000. So it's not a big increment for Orangetown. And hopefully they'll be kind of coming out of their financial crisis. I just want to note also for folks who are interested in they had one time thought about moving to Orangetown and on the site where the Homes for Heroes is. They still have an interest in that for a facility that would relate to training service dogs in cooperation with the veterans, some of whom have PTSD and other conditions for which service dogs are a great benefit. But that, I think, is kind of speculative at this point, but it's a nice idea, and it's possible that could materialize in the future. But in the meantime, they're reinvesting where they are in Pomona. Number 16 is another tax cert, and this one is for vote tonight. Blavat Mini Mall. Wow, that's a big refund.
That's a big refund.
What's that?
That's a big refund.
That's a big one.
It's a big case. It's actually on appeal.
Dennis, if you could just speak into the microphone.
Before the Appellate Division, Second Department. This is where Mia Kachina is, if you're curious. There was a won't get into the legal details, but it was a challenging case, and Brian Kenny recommends this settlement, as does our outside appraiser, Bill Beckman of Beckman Appraisals, who was retained and involved in this for quite some time. So this is a well thought out settlement.
Someone want to make a motion for this one?
Moved.
We have to vote on that tonight? Oh, yes.
There,
Yes, because it's on appeal right now before the Second Department. They can make a decision any day. So we're trying to get the settlement documents in place before the Appellate Division renders a decision, which would
could be worse.
could create an interesting issue.
And we're assuming the school district.
Oh, absolutely. They're about
the biggest nut of it.
they're contemporaneously approving it at the same time we are.
Okay.
Maybe not tonight, maybe last night or tomorrow night, but it's about the same time.
So who had the motion on that one? Tom?
Yep.
Jerry, you want to second that? All in favor, say aye. Aye. The ayes have it. Thanks, Dennis. There's a workshop item, police uniforms, a bid for dry cleaning on uniforms, a highway personnel item, creating a position assistant automotive mechanic. Jim, do you want to address that in any way, or is town board?
No.
Yeah, I know we've all talked with you about it. Number 20 is the installation of a stop sign. Note 21 is a memorial bench. It's from the Parks Department. This will be a bench out on the J.B. Clark Rail Trail. And was there any other new business the town board wanted to discuss tonight? think, did we miss anything?
Adjournment, Ed Cook Senior.
There was another individual I actually was gonna do an adjournment for. Do you remember who that was?
She's asked to be on the.
Okay, the next meeting, okay. So we have in the memory of Mr. Ed Cook Senior, a former employee of our building department for 20 years, retired in 2006, and with regards to his family, I'll make a motion to close this meeting. Do I have a second? From Dennis Troy, all in favor, say aye. The ayes have it. Safe journeys home.